The only thing I'll say by way of introduction is that this piece stems from a new book project that I'm working on, titled Expanded Poetics, Romantic Modernist Contemporary. And the research project that our group on the Romantic Fragment sort of sprung from is funded by the grant for that book project. And this paper that I'll give tonight is something that I've been working on for the past couple months on Beethoven and Basquiat. And it's going to be the first chapter of this book, which will also include chapters on Aimé Césaire and the relationship of negritude and free verse to the Haitian Revolution. A chapter on the architect Peter Zumthor and his relationship to Heidegger and Hölderlin. And also a chapter on Lisa Robertson, the contemporary poet, and her relationship to Rousseau and to Baudelaire, maybe among other things, but that's how I'm conceptualizing the project for now. So I'm just getting started on this, and this is a piece in which I'm taking up for the first time an attempt at some musical commentary and trying to think through these citations to Beethoven's Third Symphony in Basquiat's later canvases. So with that said, I'll just begin. And if anything goes wrong in the presentation, please just interrupt me because I can't see the chat so that I can see my slides more easily. So don't hesitate to interrupt me by speaking. Okay, so the title of the talk is Field and Fragment, the Future of Romantic Composition from Basquiat to Beethoven. On May 23rd, 1987, an exhibition of 3 drawings by Jean-Michel Basquiat opened at the Tony Shafrazi Gallery in New York. A show at this gallery would have been emotionally charged, since Basquiat's friend Andy Warhol had died 3 months earlier, and it was at Shafrazi's gallery that Warhol and Basquiat exhibited their last collaborative show in the fall of 1987. The 1985 show was met with negative reviews, resulting in the end of their collaboration and a hiatus in their friendship. And even before that, in June 1985, Warhol had written in his diary, "Called Jean-Michel and he hasn't called me back. I guess he's slowly breaking away. He used to call me all the time from wherever he was." Then a month after the exhibition closed, Warhol writes, "Jean-Michel hasn't called me in a month, so I guess it's really over." They did resume their friendship, but it waned in subsequent years, and this probably contributed to an even deeper sense of loss when Warhol died in 1987. Basquiat became reclusive, isolating himself in the studio, and the works that he exhibited 3 months later are implicitly elegiac. The greatest of those canvases, I think, one of the masterpieces of Basquiat's oeuvre, is titled Pegasus, alluding to Warhol's use of the Mobil Gas logo on their 1985 collaborative canvas, a winged horse that Warhol printed in black. The phrase "broken wing" appears repeatedly in the complex compositional field of Basquiat's canvas, with the words earth, ground written above, and the somber descent of a black sky encroaches across the top of the piece. In the upper left corner, just to the left of its inverted dark ground, we read the words Schwartz, 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 black, Schwartz, black. I'll return to the elusive and historical complexity of these inscriptions, but considered in terms of the relation between the drawing's title and the seeping opacity of its upper limit, it is as though the blackness of Warhol's Pegasus has been condensed from its figural function as mythic reference and corporate brand into the very substance of mourning, rising from the grave into the night of recollection and falling as the broken wing of remembrance upon the field of signs to delimit their infinite dispersion, both occluding and determining their meaning. Heart is arena, we read again and again, sometimes with a copyright sign appended to the phrase. The fact that grief can be bought and sold does not diminish, but rather deepens its intensity. The elegiac significance of Pegasus is implied as well by the repeated inscription across the whole canvas of the Italian word for heroic, Eroica. sometimes crossed out and always like the word Pegasus written inside a rectangle. There is a particularly dense cluster of these inscriptions at the center of the composition, and another work from 1987 is titled Eroica, and dominated by a vertical column of 10 inscriptions of the word down the right side. In 1988, Basquiat would produce 2 more works titled Eroica, which form a diptych. Eroica is, of course, the title of Beethoven's Third Symphony, perhaps the most historically and formally important of his works. And the slow second movement of that symphony is titled Funeral March. So a simple explanation for the density of references to Beethoven's symphony in Basquiat's later works, suspended between Warhol's death in 1987 and his own death in 1988, would be that he had the symphony in mind because he was listening to it while working in the studio in isolation and in mourning, and its elegiac second movement suffuses the funereal mood within which those pieces are produced. The weight of these insistent references upon the meaning of his late works, however, poses more difficult questions. If the Eroica Symphony becomes so important to Basquiat after Warhol's death that he not only disperses references to it throughout many of his canvases, but also titles 3 works after it, a gesture for which there is no precedent in Basquiat's oeuvre, then how does the symphony bear upon the compositional style and thematic concerns of his late works? How does thinking through the Eroica change the way that we think about Basquiat? And how might Basquiat's persistent citations of Beethoven's symphony alter our understanding of its cultural and historical significance? Indeed, what implications might Basquiat's encounter with Beethoven have for the way in which we think about the production of meaning in music and visual art? And how, following the cue of German Romantic theories of relations among the arts, might we come to understand the relation between music and visual art as mediated by poetry, particularly since Beethoven liked to refer to himself as a tone poet, Tondichter, and since many of Basquiat's late compositions are as proximate to poetry as they are to painting. In taking up these questions, I want to foreground the complex relation between meaning and genre in Beethoven's Eroica and Basquiat's Pegasus. In both of these works, I'll argue, it is a dialectical relationship between formal fragmentation and fields of generic significance that enables an extraordinary complexity of meaning, and that allows them to hold together extreme discrepancies of mood and content through unusually free, yet not entirely indeterminate relations among compositional elements. It's through the formal co-determination of field and fragment that Beethoven's Eroica and Basquiat's Pegasus achieve the emotional power and profound historical content, which also makes them both, I'll suggest, exemplary romantic works. So let me begin with Eroica 1 and Eroica 2, the 1988 diptych. Since these offer a relatively simple introduction to some of the more complex signifying strategies that are deployed in Pegasus. The word Eroica is inscribed repeatedly on the right-hand panel, with a list of inscriptions on the upper right accompanied by the number 15, which probably alludes to Beethoven's 15 variations and a fugue on an original theme. Just a moment. Okay. Beethoven's 15 variations and a fugue on an original theme composed in 1802. These came to be known as the Eroica variations, since their theme reappears at the beginning of the final movement of Beethoven's Third Symphony. We can note here that the basic musical practice of variations on a theme is important to Basquiat's compositional style, since the repetition of compositional elements with formal and contextual modifications is a key device throughout his oeuvre, particularly in linking pictorial and linguistic signs. Interspersed around inscriptions of the word Eroica is a pictogram titled Man Dies, in the diagrammatic fashion so characteristic of Basquiat's work. The pictogram is drawn from Henry Dreyfus's Symbol Sourcebook, an authoritative guide to international graphic symbols, which is also the primary source of most of the pictorial signs in Pegasus. On the left-hand panel, the symbol and its label are repeated over 60 times in a loose grid alongside a list of slang terms and definitions, and merging with the visual representation of an explosion at the bottom left, itself labeled by a TNT and a chemical formula. So this panel neatly juxtaposes three different kinds of signs, the panel on the left, that we can recognize from C.S. Peirce's semiotic theory. Man dies is an icon. We can see from comparing it with the sign for friendship among men on the same page of Dreyfus's book, that it represents a man upside down with his arms spread out, as if he has just collapsed on the ground. The relation of the explosion to TNT could be read as an index. We can infer that the explosion is caused by TNT, such that the visual representation signifies the action of the explosive substance named by the acronym. Meanwhile, the chemical formula designates the molecular structure of the explosive itself, that is, a symbol that relies upon convention rather than resemblance or causality. Likewise, slang terms are symbols in Peirce's schema, where meaning relies upon conventional association rather than physical resemblance between sign and referent. So, for example, the word bang can mean either injection of narcotics or sex, depending on the context. The word bagpipe can refer to a vacuum cleaner, and bale of straw can signify white blonde female. The particular codes of specific cultural communities are central to the construction of meaning in such cases, such that slang terms, not unlike hobo symbols, depend upon their contextual address to some interlocutors and not to others. The signs construct a field and a porous boundary of inclusion-exclusion according to who can understand them, though spelling out the definitions renders their implicit meaning explicit to anyone outside the cultural context of their use. The complexity, humor, and cultural depth of Basquiat's play with relations among these types of signs is evident on the right-hand panel, where the words morning glory and sweet potato appear above what look to be drawings of sweet potatoes, and thus they're labeled as icons. Since sweet potatoes are in fact the tuberous roots of the flowers that are known as morning glories, there is an indexical dimension to these signs. That is, where there are morning glories, there are also sweet potatoes, potentially. But this is also true in a less innocent sense. If we read these as slang terms, as Basquiat's list of slang definitions suggests that we should, then morning glory can also refer to waking up with an erection, while the term sweet potato can function by synecdoche as a sexually objectifying reference to a woman, as it does, for example, in the sexual subtext of Lonnie Johnson's 1927 blues song, Sweet Potato Blues. The recessed blues reference here then links this cluster of signs to the truncated inscription on the right side of the canvas, "For blues, fixin' to die blue," citing Buku White's 1940 song, "Fixin' to Die Blues." So the blues then comes into contact with Basquiat's citations of Beethoven's Eroica, connecting with the latter's funeral march. And these musical references are thus linked by the hobo sign, "Man dies." "I'm looking funny in my eyes," Buku White's song begins, "and I believe I'm fixin' to die." Basquiat's visual semantic exercises teach us how to read with gallows humor, how to look funny in the eyes. We have to be attentive to irony, to implication, to shifting registers and levels of sense, to determinations of compositional context that can link flowers and tube roots to the physiology and verbal idioms of sexual desire, that can turn the vegetable world of pastoral into the erotic humor of a slang aubade, a dong song tethering the cultural tradition of the blues to European classical music through compositional proximity of reference. At the crux of this compositional association, "Man dies" grounds the universal in a deepening of the particular. The oracular present tense of the words, at once explaining and estranged by their pictorial symbol, function simultaneously as statement of fact, as persistent recollection, and as ominous premonition. Unlabeled, the pictogram signifies only among the community of those who know how to read it. Basquiat inducts us into the sense of that kind of sign, while also incorporating it into the highly indeterminate, historically shifting codes of what we call art. which we may or may not learn how to read. But this is what Basquiat has to say about what is called the art world. I don't think there really is an art world. There's a few good artists, and then everything else is extra. I don't really think the art world exists. I really don't think it exists. I mean, there's people who like paintings, and then there's dealers, and then there's people who work at the museum, but I don't think they're collectively an art world. So there are artists, and there are those involved in buying, selling, exhibiting, and looking at art, but they do not constitute the kind of collective that would constitute a world. We might say that the artist for Basquiat is the one who knows not only how to read, but also to produce and relay signs without diminishing their esoteric sense. While the rest of us, the buyers, sellers, institutions, and critics, are parasites living off the value of that power. Now, Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, as it came to be titled, is riven with semantic and interpretive puzzles at the crux of artistic intention and historical determination, which far exceed the consciousness of the composer. The kind of signs it is the specific power of the artist to produce without having to know exactly what they mean. Chief among these is the problem of the symphony's title, the legend of which has cast a long shadow on its reception. Having sketched out much of the symphony in 1802 and written the full manuscript in the summer and fall of 1803, the full score, Beethoven had inscribed the name Bonaparte on the title page of the score, apparently positioning the work as an homage to Napoleon. But as the story was reported by his pupil, Ferdinand Ries, when he learned in May of 1804 that Napoleon had become Emperor of France, he tore the title page of the symphony in half and bellowed his famous denunciation. Is he too nothing more than an ordinary human being? Now he too will trample on all the rights of man and indulge only his own ambition. He will exalt himself over all others and become a tyrant, unquote. Now, in fact, we know that Beethoven did not tear the title page in half, since the page is preserved with the name Bonaparte crossed out so violently that holes were ripped under the pen. Beethoven would note to publishers in the summer of 1804 that the title of the symphony is really Bonaparte. But when it was published in 1806, the title read Sinfonia Eroica, and then in Italian, composed to celebrate the memory of a great man. It's right here. The figure of the hero thus dominates narrative and programmatic readings of Beethoven's symphony. In considering the significance of Basquiat's interest in the symphony, it will indeed be important to consider occluded historical implications of Beethoven's original homage to Napoleon. But in the context of Basquiat's citational practice, what I find more significant than the legend of Beethoven's shifting attitudes toward Bonaparte is the material fact that the original title was crossed out. The crossing out of words, placing them under erasure, is a central gesture of Basquiat's compositional style and of his signifying strategies. And nowhere in his oeuvre is this gesture foregrounded more assertively than in the 1987 canvas, Eroica, on the right. Basquiat would sometimes say that he crossed out words to make them stand out, but he would also say that he did so to make them recede into the background. Whatever his intention, the barring of the signifier has the inevitable effect of a sublation. The word is at once canceled and preserved, and what is barred in one place usually appears unbarred in another, as is demonstratively the case on this canvas. But here the operation takes on a further complexity due to its citational significance. In the title of Beethoven's symphony, the adjective Eroica, heroic, replaces a proper name, Bonaparte, that had been itself crossed out. Thus, there is a redoubled dialectic at work. Bonaparte is crossed out and replaced by Eroica by Beethoven, while Basquiat now crosses out Eroica while also inscribing it elsewhere unbarred. The crossing out of Eroica refers to the crossing out of Bonaparte, but it does so without the latter being written at all. It redoubles the suppression of an absent sign. And while Basquiat's canvas is titled Eroica, the barred and unbarred inscription of that title within the compositional field both cancels its heroic reference and lets it stand. Thus, while Beethoven's composition comes to be titled Sinfonia Eroica, we might say that Basquiat cites the symphony as both heroic and not heroic. The scratching out of the citation cancels and preserves that designation through difference and repetition, through scriptural variations on a theme. Thus, it matters as well that the greatest of Basquiat's 1987 canvases, perhaps his most epic composition, and the one in which the word Eroica is inscribed more often than in any other work, is not titled Eroica, but rather Pegasus. The titular reference implicitly shifts then from Beethoven to Warhol, and precisely through that shift, it also gestures towards Beethoven's original homage to Napoleon. But it would be quite inadequate to make the simple claim on this basis that while Napoleon is the implicit hero of Beethoven's Eroica, Warhol is the implicit hero of Basquiat's Pegasus. The work certainly is, as I've argued, an homage to Warhol, and thus a work inscribed to the memory of someone Basquiat did indeed consider a great man. But as is the case of Beethoven's Symphony, the sheer generic and thematic heterogeneity of the work belies any reductive insistence on the prevailing significance of that gesture, even if an implicit dedication to Warhol does indeed frame the work, and even if the work importantly includes it. It's the compositional construction of this heterogeneity and its formal relation to Beethoven's Symphony to which we must now turn. Now, the mind reels at an initial approach to the sheer density of signs within Pegasus, a semiotic density set off against the visual lightness of its background, with this tension itself redoubled by the horizon at which the play of figure and ground or word and page meets the black sky that at once subsumes and concentrates all meaning above the scene of writing. There is a sense, however, in which it is also a relatively simple work. So, like the Man Dies pictogram, the majority of the signs composing the work are drawn from Dreyfus's symbol sourcebook. And now Basquiat works with the signs, with signs drawn from across the catalog's discrepant sections. So sections including engineering, communications, manufacturing, forestry, alchemy, astrology, and hobo signs. Often repeated across the canvas, we encounter marks that are labeled, for example, roller crusher, pine forest, diode, sprayer, tape recorder, spirits, buzzer, bell, water-cooled condenser, pressure source tank, atomizer, receiver, water, urine, oscilloscope, glass blower, and jet mixer. Though these signs are drawn from the same book, they refer to radically different practices, contexts, communities, histories, moods, and social and natural worlds. The repetition of the signs in different compositional configurations also renders their sense contextually variable, such that, for example, the symbol for pine forest might signify one way, inscribed beside the words granite, concrete, glass, and steel, and above the word for water cooler, while signifying differently when inscribed under earth, ground, and beside loans, and above Pegasus, as on the right. Now, exactly how the significance of those contexts differ would be hard to specify, and this is part of the point. The compositional field constructs contexts of ambiguous and amorphous meaning that are not, however, completely indeterminate. To read the contextual sense of the signs too determinately is usually an interpretive trap, but to leave the determination of their significance aside entirely is to surrender the task of interpretation. So what's required is attention to the type of signs involved, the worlds and moods and histories they imply, and a sensitivity to the genres and styles of meaning that they may suggest. So for example, we could say that concrete, glass, and steel are modernist materials, while references to granite and pine forest draw those into relation with a natural world exceeding human existence, while the sign for water cooler might suggest an infrastructural or automotive context, even as the label itself may imply the white-collar world of office work. Perhaps a skyscraper looms vaguely into view in the juxtaposition with the primeval forest, suggesting a tension between 20th century life worlds and the earthliness with which they come into contradiction, that is, between city and country. On the other hand, we could picture a pine forest beneath the earth we could picture a pine forest between the earth below and Pegasus above, while the adjacent reference to loans deflates this mythical world by bringing it into relation with a register of social realism. Now, these are tenuous associations that are indeed partially subjective, but they're not untethered from compositional determinations. On the one hand, the act of interpretation involves describing associations as one surveys discrepant regions of the composition, and on the other hand, one attempts in doing so to keep those associations meaningfully responsive and accountable to typological, generic, and perhaps art historical determinations suggested by the configurations of signs. Like the signs themselves, the partial determinacy of these associations, sustained in tension with their ambiguity, is in large part conventional. Part of the overall meaning of the work is that it both leads us to read in this way and to reflect on the fact that we're doing so. So the problem of signification is reflexively at issue. And the experience of the work, the feeling of its reception, is that of groping toward flickering partial determinations of sense that situate the viewer amid the interpretive responses that they bring to bear, as much as the viewer tries to situate the signs. We become acutely aware of the historical ground of our associations, of their relation to our subject position, to our practical competencies, and the regions of knowledge that we bring to bear, as well as those of our ignorance, which inhibits our capacity to grapple with huge swaths of meaning that may be implied by compositional elements and contextual gestures. The hobo signs Basquiat deploys press this point home with a complex pathos. 3 of these are the most common, repeated across the canvas. Nothing to be gained here, easy mark, sucker, and cowards will give to get rid of you. The first of these exemplifies the effect of artistic citation upon the meaning of the sign. So for example, you can see them, here's nothing to be gained here, easy mark, sucker, and then over here, somewhere right here, cowards will give to get rid of you. So the first of these exemplifies the effect of artistic citation on the meaning of the sign. Inscribed at the threshold of a town or a house by a hobo, the sign notifies those who know how to read its meaning to look elsewhere for whatever they might want or need. But inscribed on a massive canvas destined to the worldless context of late capitalist art, the sign resonates with an ironic concurrence of bitter sarcasm and sincere despair. The sign may imply that there is nothing to be gained anywhere. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. But it might also seem to connote the rapacious and selective eye of the market, discarding whatever can't be exploited while only retaining what can. And it might also therefore connote the tedium of having to deal with the rules of that game, however little one believes in it. Displayed in the gallery, easy mark, sucker, and cowards will give to get rid of you take on a similar double edge, at once bristling with polemic and burdened with knowing exhaustion. To profit from the worldless art market, which one knows to be devoid of genuine truth and genuine recognition, is to want to get out of it. Everything depends, when it comes to the feeling of these signs and their interpretation, on how one feels oneself to be related to the figure of the hobo. Is the sign for me, or is it for someone else? And is it therefore about me? Is the here where nothing is to be gained the place where I am, or is it elsewhere? Am I the one looking to gain and moving on, or am I the easy mark or the coward? Am I included in the social field of the already comfortable, for whom these signs are merely a matter of interest? Or, since I'm excluded from such comfort, are they a matter of life and death? Again, such questions point to an order of interpretive ambiguity attendant not only upon the question of what the sign means, but also upon the question of who reads it. It's not simply a matter of a firm boundary between inclusion and exclusion of one who belongs or doesn't belong to particular communities of usage, but rather of subtle shades of sense, inflections of irony, timbers of affect that apply in one case or another. Since we're never sure just who we are, since we may disavow or mistake our interests or priorities, since we might disidentify with who we're supposed to be or identify with what we're not, the texture of interpretive experience is uneven, and the tonality of its mood may flicker among variant or contradictory determinations. What I want to suggest is that the strategies, styles, and ambiguities of signification I've been analyzing could be meaningfully understood as symphonic. That is, they correspond to a set of interpretive problems, modes of reception, and compositional innovations attendant upon the development of the symphony as the most prestigious musical form in the late 18th and early 19th century, as well as the rise in tandem with that generic development of what would come to be called absolute music. Now, at the heart of this historical sequence is Beethoven's Third Symphony. My argument is that we can read Basquiat's citations of the Eroica not only as a direct reference to what he's listening to in the studio, or to the elegiac mood of the second movement of the funeral march, and as an implicit homage to Warhol after Beethoven's sublated tribute to Napoleon, But we can also understand the Eroica as a formal antecedent to Basquiat's compositional strategies, their signifying effects, and their complex manifestations of historical feeling. In his important 1810 review of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, E.T.A. Hoffmann wrote that, quote, "When music is spoken of as an independent art, the term can properly apply only to instrumental music, which scorns all aid, all admixture of other arts, and gives pure expression to its own peculiar artistic nature." As a number of critics have argued, this claim relays an epochal shift in approaches to musical meaning that had already been underway for at least 20 years. Whereas music had previously been understood to rely upon the inclusion of words to convey determinate meaning, the rise of the symphony as a key genre from Haydn through Mozart to Beethoven was attended by a tendency to conceive of instrumental music itself, without sung texts, as a vehicle of ideas and as a kind of ritualized enactment of community, with inherently deep political implications. The term absolute music, which began to be used in the mid-19th century, had two closely related senses, both anticipated by Hoffmann's review. On the one hand, it referred to instrumental music as an independent art, which expresses only its own peculiar nature, and on the other hand, it referred to a metaphysical or ontological vocation of music, which, as Hoffmann put it, reveals to man an unknown realm, a world quite separate from the outer sensual world surrounding him, unquote. Yet, as Karl Dahlhaus has established, the claim that it was by scorning all admixture of other arts that instrumental music accessed an otherwise unknown realm distinct from the realm of objects was often accompanied by an apparently conflicting commitment to the profoundly poetic nature of music without words. This apparent conflict is resolved by the concept of romantische Poesie, advanced by Friedrich Schlegel in the Athenaeum fragments, which referred not to a specifically literary practice, but to poiesis as the creative ground of all the arts. Thus, if Hoffmann considered music, as he put it, the most romantic of all arts, one might say the only one that is purely romantic, we could understand this to mean that only pure music without admixture of other arts could access the deep ground of all the arts, a poiesis antecedent to determinate objects, nouns, or representational forms. As Gustav Mahler would testify, quote, "My need to express myself musically, symphonically, only begins where the dark sensations rule, at the door that leads to the other world, the world in which things are no longer separated by time and place." But where does this understanding of the non-referential dimension of music, beyond or beneath the sensuous world of objects, immanent to itself and expressive only of its own nature, leave us with respect to the associative dimension of listening, the historical content of music, and its capacity to convey specific ideas? And here I find Dahlhaus's book, The Idea of Absolute Music, indispensable insofar as it allows us to read between the lines of discrepant romantic positions on these questions, which, taken together, I think, imply a dialectical understanding of musical meaning as occupying a shifting terrain between pure indetermination on the one hand and programmatic determinacy on the other. For Ludwig Tieck, symphonies, quote, "reveal the most mysterious and mysterious language. They do not depend on the laws of probability. They do not need to attach themselves to any story or character. They remain in their purely poetic world." Citing this description, Dahlhaus claims that, quote, "in the terminology of the time around 1800, symphonies are neither historical nor characteristic, but rather poetic." He says, "They tell no story, and they avoid naming a specific, well-delineated pathos or ethos whose expression the music is intended to be." Yet Dahlhaus also cites an analogy between music and romantic poetry, which is articulated by Novalis, which suggests a somewhat more nuanced approach to the content of musical meaning. Novalis writes, he speaks of tales without coherence, yet with associations like dreams, poems merely euphonious and full of beautiful words, yet also devoid of all sense and coherence. At most, individual verses are comprehensible, like many fragments of the most diverse kinds of things. True poetry can at most have an allegorical sense in the large scale and produce an indirect effect, like music, etc. Here Novalis looks well ahead of his own moment toward the poetics of Mallarmé, of Dada and Surrealism, and of artists like Cy Twombly, and above all, Jean-Michel Basquiat. There are three things I want to emphasize in Novalis's evocative formulation. First, his analogy displaces the opposition between story and pure music through the category of tales without coherence, the logic of which is associative rather than narrative, like dreams. Second, an assemblage of fragments of the most diverse kinds of things supplies the formal means of producing tales whose logic is associative rather than narrative. And third, such fragmentary tales rely upon a rhetorical production of meaning, not a one-to-one correspondence between sign and reference, but an indirect effect of what he calls allegorical sense proper to the large scale. So here we have a complex notion of allegory as indirect reference exceeding the bounds of any one sign or narrative path, which develops cumulatively by association at the large scale of the whole work. It's this last element of Novalis's sense of romantic poetry that seems to motivate his analogy with music, and particularly the symphony. Theodore Adorno may have had Novalis's analogy in mind when he set down his own position on these questions in an important passage from his notes toward a book on Beethoven. He writes, "The dispute whether music can portray anything definite or is merely a play of sound patterns and motion no doubt misses the point. A far closer parallel is with dream, to the form of which, as Romanticism well knew, music is in many ways so close. In the first movement of Schubert's Symphony in C major, at the beginning of the development, we feel for a few moments as if we were at a rustic wedding. An action seems to begin unfolding, but then is gone at once, swept away in the rushing music, which, once imbued with that image, moves onward to a quite different measure. Images of the objective world appear in music only in scattered, eccentric flashes, vanishing at once, but they are, in their transience, music's essence. The program is, so to speak, the musical residue left over from the day's dealings. While the music lasts, we are in it as much as we are in a dream. We are at the rustic wedding, then carried away in the musical flood, heaven knows where. It may be similar with death. Perhaps the affinity between music and death has its locus here. I believe the images flitting past to be objective, not merely subjective associations." This is quite a precise and counterintuitive concept of musical program. After Freud's analysis of dream work, the point would be that the latent content of a musical composition is subject to operations of condensation and displacement, and the images of the objective world produced by the resulting manifest content are fragmented, scattered eccentric flashes vanishing at once. Since it's the very transience of those fragments that make the music's essence as an essentially temporal art, this is the locus of the affinity between music and death. As Daniel Barenboim writes, there is, quote, "a lifespan of a single note. It is finite. The terminology is definite. The note dies." And here we might have the first clear indication of the content of music. The disappearance of sound by its transformation into silence is the definition of its being limited in time, unquote. Adorno extends this point about the finitude of sounded musical units to the psychic images produced by musical themes, by the transience of their transformations. But what is the ground of Adorno's claim that these fleeting images are objective and not merely subjective associations? The specific image of a rustic wedding, in fact, had never quite occurred to me while listening to the passage in Schubert's C major symphony, until I encountered his suggestion of the image. This variability of musical impressions is why many critics hold that such images are merely subjective associations, having nothing to do with music per se. But this response, I think, overlooks the mediation between musical form and subjective response by the conventional codes of genre and mode. Indeed, topic theory is a branch of musicology dedicated to the study of how the production of musical meaning between production and reception is mediated by generic stylistic and rhetorical conventions established historically and productive of what I would call fields of association. In an essay titled Symphonies and the Public Display of Topics, Elaine Sisman notes that, quote, "the celebrated French opera composer Grétry wrote in his memoir, published in 1797, that Haydn's symphonies should be considered a vast dictionary by opera composers to be mined without scruple, for musical figures to be fitted to the expression of texts. The melodic fecundity of the symphonies reflected the composer's freedom to create out of nothing, yet were so expressive that their figures could easily accompany texts whose very specificity fettered the imagination. This gloss on Grétry's suggestion implies a nuanced position on debates about absolute music and their relation to the development of symphonic form. Texts accompanying music do indeed fetter the imagination, insofar as they may be too determinate in relation to the relative indeterminacy of musical meaning. But even if composers of instrumental music without words are apparently free to create out of nothing, it is precisely the melodic fecundity of the symphony which prevents its dissolution into a total indeterminacy of meaning. That is, the figures that unfold amid such fecundity are expressive types appropriate to certain kinds of sense and not others, such that they may be fitted to the expression of texts. Grétry's description of Haydn's 104 symphonies as a vast dictionary suggests that while absolute music may diverge from the supposed determinism of meaning implied by texts, its figural determinations are still recognizable, case by case, as suitable for some kinds of expression rather than others. I would suggest that a reading of Beethoven's Eroica along these lines displaces many false oppositions and unnecessary impasses in its critical reception. And it also illuminates the formal relationship between Beethoven's signifying strategies and those of Basquiat, however different their medium. In the case of Beethoven's Eroica and Basquiat's Pegasus, those strategies depend above all on opening a compositional field vast enough on the large scale, as Novalis says, to unfold indirect effects that cohere not through clear thematic narrative, but rather repetitive iterations, producing both contextual displacements and synthetic relays among fragmentary units. The Eroica symphony was about twice as long as its generic predecessors, and has often been noted, this enables the inclusion within the piece, particularly its colossal first two movements, of an unprecedented proliferation of themes, variations, harmonic complications, stylistic registers, and shifting moods. On the one hand, attempts to narrativize the formal and emotional vicissitudes of the symphony have involved questions about who its putative hero might be and who the funeral march commemorates, or efforts to read the piece as a complex character study of heroism in general, with allusions to both ancient and modern types. On the other hand, formalist analytical approaches to the symphony often leave aside thematic and historical content altogether. What I think is necessary is an approach to the symphony along the lines of what Novalis describes, suggesting fragmentary flashes of diverse associations, correlated to a proliferation and varied iterability of themes that are formally mediated by conventional generic and stylistic types. The first movement of the symphony, so I just try to highlight some of the things that I mentioned as I go through these parts of the score in red. The first movement of the symphony begins with two bracing tutti chords in the tonic of E flat major, followed by a statement of the primary theme by the cello and the bass, and then descending into a dissonant C sharp attended by keening violins in G. Already within the first 7 bars, we have the simultaneous orchestral unity of massive chords offset by the establishment of a warm melodic phrase, which will then be prodigiously varied, inverted, and modified across the 4 movements, followed by the divergent anxiety of strings in the upper registers, splitting the unity of the opening chords, and emotionally qualifying the warm optimism and momentum of the initial theme with a sense of expectation, what the Germans call Erwartung. Already, the historical situation of the symphony is expressed, composed as it was at the crux of modernity. Unity is unity in strife. The bracing hammer blows that open the symphony and repeat across the first movement, while the momentum of hope is riven by an anxious unknowing, tenuously pressing into the future. The contradictions of Beethoven's own historical and subjective situation, legible in the sublated homage to Napoleon, are also implicit here. A partisan of revolutionary goals, though not necessarily revolution itself, admiring of the Napoleonic project, yet writing battle hymns for Austria, observing the movement of history in the early 19th century with optimism, trepidation, and divided loyalties amid the personal crisis of his incipient deafness, suicidal inclinations, and the social isolation that he set out in his Heiligenstadt Testament of 1802. The simultaneity and division of uncertainty and hope is the complex opening mood of the Eroica. The theme is then picked up by the soaring fragility of flute and clarinet, accompanied by the communicative depth of horns, passing into a brief section of call and response between strings and winds before a pulsing orchestral crescendo, sforzando chords and triumphant horns blaring the theme while backgrounded by high tremolo strings and winds, appending a keening anxiety to the mood of martial triumph. And then we enter a section of call and response on a brief new theme in the mode of pastoral, between winds undergirded by plunking strings, before the slingshot of strong tutti chords into a breathless galloping rhythm right here on strings that will recur throughout the movement. So in this section of the exposition of the symphony's first movement between the bars 15 and 83, the basic thematic cells and oppositions of the first movement are laid out. There's an alternation between pastoral, contemplative, lonely, or reflective mood, often carried by the winds in the upper register, and a charging, pulsing, driving momentum of eighth notes on strings overlaid with martial horns. And synthesizing or working across these, there are passages of call and response between instrumental sections, or seemingly distant tones of horns and winds that traverse or communicate between different parts of the orchestra, between different rhythms of the music and the thematic worlds that they bring into being. Often these passages of reflective pastoral or of martial conflict and triumph will be attended, broken up, or synthesized by warm romantic passages on strings that access regions of feeling flowing beneath, through, or between these discrepant moods. The extraordinary drama of these alternations and synthetic passages is marked by peaks of high flutes dissolving into the nothingness of the ether, or by slow, momentous buildups of tension involving the whole orchestra, and culminating with the famous catastrophic tutti chords and blaring horns, which are then followed by ominously quiet, pulsing strings, then giving way to another passage of lilting pastoral melody carried by bassoons and flutes, as if nothing had happened, before plunging once more into a daunting, charging orchestral buildup of tension that's followed by a passage of warm, reflective, rising and falling woods and strings. All of these elements are readily identified in the allegro. The question is how their shifting combinations and their cohesion across the movement should be framed. The key to undoing their attachment to a single narrative or character study while sustaining their associative meaning is, in my view, to sense the way in which they correspond to different geographical settings, correlated with different ways of life, temporal rhythms, and affective worlds, discrepant varieties of hope, longing, courage, anxiety, and contemplation. There are indeed, as Adorno says of Schubert's C major symphony, or they are indeed, attended by images such as charging horses, clashing infantry, perhaps a cowherd making his way upon a lightly wooded path, a plowman raising his eyes to look out across the fields, a martial horn heard at a distance as an army passes by a town. The second movement is titled Funeral March, and we certainly do hear and imagine a procession winding its way to the boneyard in somber reflection and proud tribute. But we might also imagine, as the mood shifts into a pastoral mode at bar 69, very different kinds of scenes taking place somewhere else. An infant sighs at its mother's breast, a young boy traipses through the fields, as elsewhere a soldier expires upon the battlefield, or lovers swoon upon the grass beside a brook, or perhaps a composer glances out the window of his rustic cabin. Around bars 130 to 153, we're closer to the overwhelming intensities of metaphysical drama, a contest of fates and powers on the order of the gods, than we are to the collective subjectivity of the funeral march. And the passage of sorrowful beauty that follows is of a crushing, solitary mood that feels far off from, and yet emotionally connected with, the communal procession. It's the historical simultaneity of different geographical settings and emotional worlds conveying the profound discrepancies of what happens at the same time that is the specific power of this symphony and the compound locus of its synthetic truth. It gathers into itself something like the contrasting feeling of countryside and battlefield, death and architecture, homage and remembrance, carefree ease and fatal extremity, as Europe passes through the wrenching transition from one historical epoch into another at the contradictory core of capitalist modernity and political revolution. In the symphony's finale, as winds and blaring horns rejoin strings at bar 315, and as pulsing syncopations combine and blend with thundering colossal chords and with aching winds in the high register, and then as a rest divides the unbearable tension of this passage, from the entry of a slow, delicate, agonizing, and mournful melody shared among oboes, clarinets, and bassoons, the listener feels the cumulative drama of the symphony fold together in the tenderness of a hope that barely dares to speak its name. An undercurrent of naive longing for something good to come of the circumstances too vast and complex to fathom, and within which to trace the trajectory of their fragile, exhilarating, and frightening telos. So about 8 more minutes. Eroica, writes Basquiat again and again, under erasure or not, and as he does so, everything I've been describing and much more passes into the meaning of that word, into its iterated displacements, from its composition in 1802 and 3 to the composition of Pegasus in 1987. Fragments of sense, flickering images, and transient feelings pass into one another, jostle in contradiction as we listen or as we look, heart as arena. The words pine forest are adjacent to concrete glass steel, while broken wing is read alongside punch inhibit unit shift. Below the black sky, shadowing the canvas, we see the drawing of a domed building titled Griffith Observatory, Los Angeles, California, copyright, with a little protruding rectangle to signify a telescope, ready to carry our gaze into the deepest regions of space. Nearby, we see a nearly identical domed building without a telescope labeled Monticello. The meaning of such a juxtaposition is by no means entirely determinate, but it's not entirely indeterminate. It occupies a certain field of sense that has to be limbed, and nor is it, that has to be limbed typologically and tentatively, yet without surrendering the task of interpretation. So the Griffith Observatory, which was a philanthropic gift from a mining baron to the city of Los Angeles, is modeled on the architectural type of Thomas Jefferson's plantation, which is in turn typologically modeled on Roman architecture. The content of so simple a juxtaposition is profoundly historical, if established by indirection. One sees the transmission of empire and of slavery from age to age, undergirding the ideological dreams and the mythic presumptions of America. Now, if references to Monticello foreground the fact of slaveholding behind the myth of the benevolent founding father, Thomas Jefferson, what are the implications of this kind of historical content for Basquiat's citations of Beethoven's Eroica? Beethoven may have crossed out his homage to Bonaparte when Napoleon declared himself emperor, but there would have been other reasons for canceling that tribute, to which Beethoven seems to have been inattentive, and which are therefore never mentioned in speculative accounts of the significance of the symphony's title. One such reason would be that before Napoleon declared himself emperor, he had reestablished slavery in the French colonies in 1802 after it had been abolished in 1794, and also that Napoleon had Toussaint Louverture, the heroic leader of the Haitian Revolution, arrested and jailed in the same year. That is to say in 1802. Denied medical care or any contact with his family while he was imprisoned, Toussaint would die alone in April of 1803, an event that was widely reported by May, just prior to the summer in which Beethoven wrote out the score to his Third Symphony. The Eroica folds the movement of European history into its complex field, but does it include the constitutive relation of that history to its colonial periphery? What's the significance of the Haitian Revolution for this signature symphony of the age of revolutions? Beethoven seems not to have considered such questions, nor to have intended any gesture toward Louverture in its crossing out of Bonaparte or the memorialization of a great man by his heroic symphony. But the question would have mattered to Basquiat, whose father was Haitian, and whose oeuvre includes many references to Haiti and to Toussaint himself. Such references don't appear explicitly within the fragmentary field of Pegasus, but nor are they absent at the level of implication. Basquiat writes Eroica under erasure near the top left corner of his canvas, and just beside it the word Schwarz, 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 black, Schwarz, black. Now, why is black written in German? Basquiat may have had in mind the myth of the Black Beethoven, which was initially based on the racist response of his contemporaries to his swarthy complexion. And beneath an implicit reference to that myth, perhaps an artist who was sometimes referred to obnoxiously as the Black Picasso may also have had in mind the so-called Black Napoleon, Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint is one among the heroes of Basquiat's oeuvre, and his 7-panel work, Toussaint Louverture versus Savonarola, includes the same image of Napoleon represented as a cartoon duck. It's right here and right here. That we find in his canvas, Napoleon Myth is portrayed circa 1940 to 1945. And that work seems to allude to portrayals of Franklin Roosevelt, whose name is scratched out right here, as a kind of liberator of Europe on the model of Napoleon after the capitulation of France to the Nazis, with Roosevelt's name written underneath the cartoon Napoleon, which apparently references the contribution of Looney Tunes and Disney to wartime propaganda. The use of the same image, here it is blown up, in Toussaint Louverture versus Savonarola suggests a connection between the Napoleon myth and Toussaint. And throughout Basquiat's work, the history of slavery is frequently referenced in a manner situating it as the underpinning and repressed truth of European and American revolutionary dreams. In Pegasus, we find the words ivory black and noir d'ivoire, modifying ivoire, linking inscriptions of the word black and Schwarz to the transatlantic slave trade through the Ivory Coast, and associating this sale of slave labor with the colonial extraction of ivory by poachers. So the words black and Schwarz appear repeatedly beside the word Eroica, the German usage linking them with Beethoven, while the French word noir links these with the slave trade through association with the Ivory Coast. One might locate in this cluster of associations a recessed suggestion of the same association of the Napoleon myth with Toussaint, which is established elsewhere in the oeuvre, and therefore infer the suppressed reference of Haiti to Haiti in the background of the Eroica, the repressed content of the European and American age of revolutions. By not explicitly referencing Haiti or Toussaint in his Eroica canvases, one might argue that Beethoven thereby refers to them as repressed, yet associatively implied. And this is often how the relation between fragment and field operates in Basquiat's work. So just concluding. By noting the apparently overlooked and repressed relevance of the Haitian Revolution to Beethoven's Symphony, through its implicit relevance to Basquiat's citations of the Eroica in Pegasus, I do not mean to posit a determinate counter-narrative to Beethoven's sublated tribute to Napoleon. Rather, I mean to uncover the fragmentary transient sense of that implication as it re-enters the Eroica through Basquiat's citations and thereby becomes one of its worlds, bearing upon contradictions perhaps more deeply ambiguous or unconscious than others that the symphony includes, but no less pressing for our understanding of that work and the history to which it belongs. While the romantic theory of genius is often taken to elevate the role of subjective intention in the production of the artwork, it is in fact Schelling who defines an act of genius as, quote, an unexpected concurrence of the unconscious and conscious activity, and who also tells us that, quote, the work of art reflects to the identity of the conscious and unconscious activities, but also that it therefore contains an infinity of purposes, while yet one is never able to say whether this infinity has lain within the artist himself or only resides in the work of art, unquote. Because Beethoven helps us to read modernity, to register the ironies and cruelties of its histories, to see the structures of disavowal undergirding its supposedly respectable self-presentation, he helps us to read the Eroica as well, to render at least partially determinate elements of the infinity of purposes beneath the surface of its intentions, where conscious and unconscious activities are indistinct. Such a mode of reading, this has been my argument, is particularly required by practices of composition, bringing into play a vast tension between fragment and field, a way of writing, a poetics of musical or visual signs sufficiently flexible to undetermine the deterministic and to determine the indeterminate, to establish a dialectical transmission of indirect effects. All the sadness that aches within the field of Pegasus under its black sky and across flickering repetitions of its fragments emerges not only from Warhol's death or Beethoven's funeral march, but from death itself. Man dies. And from all the modes of violence and exploitation through which the world in which Basquiat lives has come into being. Nothing to be gained here. Cowards will give to get rid of you. Novalis says that true poetry can have, at most, an allegorical sense in the large scale. At the end of his career and near the end of his life, Basquiat returns to the fragmentary critique of modernity developed across his work and turns it toward the field of Beethoven's Symphony. As he does so, by taking up the transient allegory of the Eroica within his own, he thereby produces a profound transformation of the historical meaning of its hope and of its mourning. Thanks.